The Bible is all about death and destruction. It begins and ends that way. I know Christians like to think it's love from beginning to end, but I simply cannot see it. Nor could I ever really. I just accepted it as the way it was, but I always saw it as scary and cruel. Christianity has a fatal flaw. It has several, but my concern is with Yahweh's penchant for killing and not keeping his promises to protect people and save them. We first see this in the story of Adam and Eve. It seems as if Yahweh just wanted little children to watch as they played. He didn't want them knowing good and evil so they could choose for themselves. So he obviously wanted something like an ant farm. But the first thing we see is his death threat. He put a poison tree in the midst of the garden he provided for humans to live in. Why? If he wanted them to remain ignorant, then he shouldn't have put knowledge in front of them. I mean, how stupid was he? Well, the answer, of course, is that the goal was actually for them to eat from the tree. Someone recently commented on one of my videos that nobody can thwart Yahweh's plans. If that's true, then Satan didn't thwart them, and Yahweh wanted sin to enter the world. In fact, we know this is true because Jesus was slain from the foundation of the world. So this was Yahweh's plan from the beginning. And if this was Yahweh's plan, then his wrath and bloody vengeance to come upon us for all the sinning we do were also planned. Oh, I know it was important that humans wanted to obey him because he was just so good and they loved him so much. No, it really wasn't. He didn't care about that. If he had, he wouldn't have forced Jonah to preach to Nineveh. He wouldn't have blinded Saul of Tarsus and forced him to obey. He wouldn't have forced his own son to die. He wouldn't force us at the point of a loaded gun to obey him. And Yahweh allowed a deceiver to make sure it happened, so that Adam and Eve would sin and fall under the death curse. So from the very beginning, Yahweh's plan was that we all be hexed by him to die. He stole life from us. This was by his design and foreknowledge. Then, wishing he'd never made us in the first place, Yahweh drowned most humans, telling one man how to save himself from Yahweh's wrath. Yes, this is the lovely story of Noah and the cute boat with all the little animals. Pay no attention to all the drowning babies and pregnant women floating around the boat. After that, Yahweh decided he wanted to make a big show down in Egypt. He found the man Moses and told him to go down to Egypt to get his people out, although he planned to harden Pharaoh so he could cause more death and destruction before the Exodus. Moses began the journey with his family and came to an end on the way to Egypt. At the end, Yahweh, for no apparent reason, tried to kill Moses. But apparently wasn't able to. Then Moses' wife saved Moses by cutting off her son's foreskin and flinging it at the feet of Moses. Yahweh must have been thirsting for blood or something. Anyway, as Yahweh had said, Pharaoh would not allow the Israelites to leave. He would have. But Yahweh didn't want that. He wanted to kill some more babies. I guess he hadn't drowned enough already to satisfy his sadistic needs, or he just needs a constant supply of blood. So he hardened Pharaoh's heart so he wouldn't allow the Hebrews to leave. He said, I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. Why did he do this? So that he could multiply his signs and wonders in Egypt. Later, after killing all the firstborn in Egypt, Yahweh hardened Pharaoh again. Why did he do it this time? So Pharaoh would send soldiers after Moses so that Yahweh could kill him and be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his host, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. Now, yes, he called it exacting judgment on Egypt, but it was, as I said, also so that he could be honored. Death and destruction are what he thinks honor him. Christians like to think Yahweh's killing is about justice. No, it's about making Yahweh look big and bad. Did Egypt turn to him after this? Of course not. Everything Yahweh does is for his own good pleasure. Besides that, Yahweh has children killed, babies who have done no wrong at all. That's not justice. Remember David's child conceived through David's adultery with Bathsheba? David was forgiven, but his baby was punished for his father's forgiven sin. Do you see any justice there? And you know what Yahweh gave as his reason for killing the innocent child? David had given Yahweh's enemies an occasion to blaspheme against Yahweh. It's always all about Yahweh and how he looks. And by the way, when Yahweh installed David as king, do you remember what he said? He said, David will do all my will. Shows how much Yahweh knows, doesn't it? And here's another example. Yahweh told Abraham to murder his son Isaac as a sacrifice to Yahweh. That wasn't for Abraham or Isaac's benefit. No, it was for Yahweh to find out because, he didn't know whether Abraham feared him enough to murder his own son to please him. Yahweh's motivation wasn't, and never is, any different than Satan's would be, to find out if people will bow down and worship him. That's what heaven is about, getting people who will worship Yahweh forever. He saves people for himself. Anyway, back to the killing of the firstborn in Egypt. Let's not forget the lambs that were slain that bloody night. And all the blood smeared on the sides and top of the doors so that the death angel would know which sweet little babies deserved to have their lives snuffed out. Christians like to say the flood was to get rid of the Nephilim, who shouldn't have existed. Well, I don't buy that, but those Egyptian babies, they weren't Nephilim. They were human. And that reminds me of all the blood that was spilled from all the animals the Hebrews sacrificed. But on one day alone, Solomon slaughtered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. He offered burnt offerings, meat offerings, and peace offerings, and had to hollow out the middle of the court that was before the temple to be able to burn them all. Yahweh loves the smell of burning bloody flesh, whether it's lower animals or humans. But again, back to the slaughter of the innocent children in Egypt. Now I get that Egypt had been cruel to Yahweh's special pets, so he wanted to kill their children. But this type of behavior of Yahweh's continued, as we'll see later. First, however, I want to mention something that happened before the Israelites left the wilderness and began killing everybody they ran into, at Yahweh's insistence. Wasting away in the wilderness, the Israelites grew weary when Moses went up to Yahweh's home on the mountains and stayed too long. They decided Moses could be dead or anything. I mean, who wouldn't think that when someone went up to see wrathful Yahweh? So they made themselves a god out of all the gold and silver Yahweh had them steal back in Egypt. Yahweh told Moses to get back down off the mountain so his wrath could wax hot against the Israelites and he could destroy them. See, again, it wasn't about justice. It was about appeasing Yahweh's wrath. He forgot in his hot wrath that he had promised to make a great nation out of these people and bless them. So Moses had to remind him of that to keep him from killing everybody. Moses told Yahweh that he wouldn't be honored before the Egyptians if he did that the Egyptians would say Yahweh brought the Hebrews out there just to kill them. So Yahweh, not wanting to look bad, changed his mind about killing them once Moses made him understand that it was a horrible idea. Good thing Moses had more sense than Yahweh did. For this infraction, Moses had those who were on the Lord's side to strap on their swords and go up and down the camp, slicing and dicing their brothers, companions, and neighbors, killing about 3,000 men. Moses more spilt blood at the hands of Yahweh and his followers. But here's what's interesting. Moses convinced Yahweh not to kill the people because he looked bad. But in the end, he killed them anyway, as we'll now see. Finally, it was time to enter the promised land. But the spies who were sent came back with a bad report. The majority of them were scared. Only Joshua and Caleb trusted Yahweh enough to begin the big adventure of wiping out everybody in the path of the Hebrews. So, admitting that he was breaching his promise, Yahweh decided everybody else would die in the wilderness. Yahweh had promised these people that they would inhabit the promised land. That's why they left Egypt, trusting in his promises. But because they were afraid of strong nations about them, he didn't keep his promise to them. And more than that, he even made their little children wander in the wilderness 40 years until the parents all died. Of course, later, Yahweh made a bunch of threats against the Israelites themselves. He told them that others would besiege their gates and tear down their fortified walls. He said he'd cause the Hebrews to be so hungry that they would eat their own sons and daughters. Yahweh said he himself would give them the flesh of their children to eat. Even delicate and tender men would commit evil against their brothers and wives and children. The tender and delicate woman among them, those who wouldn't venture to set the sole of their feet on the ground because they were so delicate and tender. These women's eyes would be evil toward their husbands and their sons and daughters and toward the young ones that came out of them. For they would eat their babies because of how Yahweh would cause their enemies to distress them. He wanted the Hebrews to fear his glorious and fearful name. Therefore, he said he would make their plagues wonderful and of long continuance. He vowed to bring sicknesses and plagues until they were all destroyed. He also declared that he would whet his glittering sword and render vengeance and make his arrows drunk with blood as his sword devoured flesh, the blood of the slain and the captives. He said he would rejoice over the Hebrews when he destroyed them. And they perished, and he plucked them from the land. And then, apparently after they were dead and plucked pretty much clean, he would send them back to Egypt to be servants again. He left no one out. He says, Deuteronomy 32:25, the sword without and terror within shall destroy both the young man and the virgin, the suckling also with the man of gray hairs. Yahweh was going to destroy babies and virgins and old men, obviously whether they'd done anything wrong or not. When the Israelites finally exited the wilderness, they began killing everybody they met. Yahweh usually told them to strike the nations and destroy everything they had, not to spare anyone or anything. They were to kill men and women, infants and suckling, oxen and sheep and camels and donkeys. Now this was all just to steal land. It had nothing to do with how the people of those lands behaved. Yahweh had no covenant with those people. He wasn't married to them, and they were under no obligation to him. They belonged to other gods. Other gods needed worshippers too, you know. Sure, Pharaoh had Yahweh's people, so he went down and rescued them, but these other nations, what they did was none of his business. He just wanted what they had for his own people. Yahweh apparently didn't know that during that 40 years of wandering, he could have brought the Hebrews to a land that was even better than the lands of those they were going to destroy and cast out. In all that time, they could have reached lots of places without the inhabitants of the land he wanted for the Hebrews, and they could have reached lots of places without having to murder people and sear their conscience. Or he could have removed the inhabitants of the land he wanted for the Hebrews and magically relocated those people to another place. But unfortunately, Yahweh apparently didn't know such places existed, or he just loves to watch people die in gruesome ways. Now, sometimes he allowed the Hebrews to keep young girls alive so they could use them as sex slaves. But other than that, it was mostly murder, murder, murder. So what were the Hebrews to do? I mean, it was kill others or be killed by Yahweh. What would you do in those circumstances? Probably go murder people, right? You don't want to be forced by him to eat your babies. If they didn't murder others and their babies, he was coming after them and their babies. Seriously, what would you do? Of course, the Israelites also had to kill anyone among their own group who did anything wrong. Kill their son, their wife, their brother, whoever happened to sin even slightly by getting drunk or eating too much or not being a virgin on their wedding night or suggesting one leave Yahweh and serve other gods or even picking up sticks on a particular day. Shoot, even if these people didn't cover their poop, they risked Yahweh's turning away from them. And if he turned away, what would happen? Obviously, he quit blessing them, and their enemies would destroy him. It wasn't like the other nations were any more evil than the Israelites either. They couldn't have been. What could they be doing worse than killing babies and enslaving people? Was it because the other nations worshipped idols? I don't know what that was to Yahweh, but idols were only representative of the gods, like fish or crosses are today to Christians, I suppose. Or for Catholics, it might be statues of Mary or the Rosary. Even the Israelites looked upon a human-made fiery serpent for salvation from death. So what was this about? Well, Yahweh was jealous of the other gods. That's the only reason Yahweh hated these people. And he hated their gods because they were just like him. They were super men and super women, not spirits that pervade the world and everything in it. Just as Yahweh was an old man living on a hill or in a temple, so were they. He admitted that the other gods took care of other people. He inspired someone to write this very thing for us. In Judges 11:24, we read that the god Shemesh took care of the Moabites. In 1 Kings 11:33, Yahweh condemns the Hebrews for being unfaithful to Yahweh. He says that because they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Shemesh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways to do that which is right in my eyes, and to keep my statutes and my ordinance, as did David his father, meaning Solomon's father. Yahweh had decided to take the kingdom from Solomon and give it to Jeroboam. Yahweh called these beings gods. There's absolutely no reason to think they were different from him. If that's not the case, what difference did it make what these people called their gods? It would all be Yahweh anyway, right? He was the Great Spirit and all there was, he said. So whether they called him Yahweh, El Elyon, El Shaddai, Shemesh, Odin, Adonai, or Adonis, or even Ashtoreth, what difference did it make? If he was going to present himself as a man who could walk in a garden or walk among poop, a man from whom Adam and Eve could hide among the trees, then why wasn't it okay to present himself by the name of Shemesh, since he had many different names? A god by any other name still smells as stinky. The Apostle Paul concurred with my thinking about this. Acts 17:22 through 25. Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, "You men of Athens, I perceive that you are very religious in all things. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I announce to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, he, being Lord of heaven and earth, doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. Neither is he served by men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he himself gives to all life and breath and all things." Well, that's a little crazy, since we know Yahweh did dwell in temples and he did want to be worshipped with men's hands. I mean, anything anyone does in obedience to him is usually done with hands. We need men's hands to baptize us. Christians even say today that Yahweh has no hands but our hands to do his work. But we'll just ignore that. I mean, his not dwelling in a temple and his not wanting men to use their hands to worship him are just more contradictions, which we see all the time, so it's not unusual. But I'm getting sidetracked. My point is that if an unknown God could be Yahweh, and Yahweh went by various names, why couldn't Shemesh or Ashtoreth or any name be okay to put on Yahweh? Seriously, Yahweh was angry about a name? No, he was angry because he saw Shemesh and Ashtoreth and the other gods as being just like he was. And he fought with them to gain the preeminence. Anyway, this killing and general mayhem went on for centuries. Then we come to the New Testament where Jesus appears on the scene. Now we might think things would get better, but no. They got worse. Jesus told people not to think he came to bring peace on earth, that he didn't come to bring peace but a sword. Daughter against mother, son against father, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law, he declared. Our enemies are those living with us. That's what Jesus brought. That and so much worse. Then Yahweh had the Jews kill Jesus. I don't think Isaiah 53:10 is referring to Jesus, but Christians do. And it says that it pleased Yahweh to bruise this person or these people. We do know that the New Testament, however, bears out that it was Yahweh's doing. Jesus begged not to have to die, but said he would do whatever his dad wanted. And what happened? Yahweh made him die. Why? Because without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. This was how Yahweh set things up. He had to have a human sacrifice. He had to have the shedding of blood. That's all that would make him happy. And unless there's a God higher than he is, this wasn't what was necessary, but only what it took to please this crazy thing. When we were young, they regaled us with the story of how horribly Jesus suffered. For us, of course. And we should feel ashamed and guilty because we killed him, and feel sad and sorrowful for what he went through. They told us about how he was scourged and bruised and had his back beaten to a pulp. They explained how he was nailed by the hands and feet to the cross. They informed us that the blood and water that poured from his side occurred because he really died of a literal broken heart. And all because we were and are the scum of the earth. And then they told us not to watch TV shows or read books that shared the same kind of stories because gross stuff like that would damage our spiritual relationship with bloody Yahweh and Jesus. After Jesus died, Yahweh decided that lying to an apostle was worthy of death. So he killed 2 Christians, Ananias and Sapphira. Now, Peter actually coaxed Sapphira into lying by asking her if she sold their property for the amount her husband had said. Well, what else could Sapphira say? She couldn't betray her husband once he had lied. Not that it was any of Peter's business. They didn't have to sell the property in the first place. But no good deed goes unpunished, I reckon. And the Bible says that because of this, great fear came upon the church. Yeah, I would imagine so. And again, it's all about fear. Yahweh loves to be feared. Now, love is supposed to cast out fear, because fear brings torment. But Yahweh wanted the church to fear him. That's just another one of those biblical contradictions. And yes, it's the same word in both passages. It means fear, dread, or terror. And even if it can mean respect, it's still all about Yahweh. Then Yahweh killed a bunch of Jews. He was sick of them and destroyed their holy city and left them unable to worship him as he had prescribed. He killed, or threatened to kill, depending on whether you're a preterist or a futurist, 1/3 of all people on the earth. And eventually he plans to kill pretty much everybody when Jesus comes riding in on his white horse with his sword in his mouth. Or this too has already happened, and everybody just means those same Jews. Either way, it was or will be a bloodbath. Revelation 19:15 says that he made a plan to strike the nations with his sword and rule them with a rod of iron, treading the winepress of the wrath of God the Almighty. And Revelation 14:20 states that blood poured out of the winepress all the way up to the bridles of the horses, as high as 1,600 furlongs. If indeed this death and destruction are still to come, when we're all riding horses because of a zombie apocalypse or something, Christians say it will all be our fault. They like to steal their God's glory and pretend we choose this for ourselves. But no, it's Yahweh's wrath and his vengeance. Oh, and this is their genuine loving Jesus here. So they can't try to act like he's somehow better than his Father. In fact, Jesus, like his brother Satan, can't do anything on his own. Now, he said so, and said that he did only what he saw his Father do. But of course we all die one way or another. Jesus was supposed to have ended the death curse, but we see that didn't happen. He supposedly paid the price for our sins too. And obviously the price was death. That's what Yahweh told Adam and Eve, and what he said the wages of sin was. And the New Testament reiterates this. But we still have to die. So as I said, Jesus didn't fix anything. This was just another broken promise. And if there's more to pay, i.e. punishment after death or a second death, then that's something new that Jesus tacked on. More than that, Jesus didn't pay the debt we owe if that is the case. He didn't die a second death. He didn't go to hell. And even if he did, as some claim, he didn't stay there. He was dead for maybe 40 hours or so? I'm okay with being dead for that long, aren't you? Punish me like that. I don't need anyone else to take that punishment from me. It would just be like a dreamless sleep for 40 hours. I suppose some think Jesus ended the death curse by making us all immortal so he could burn most of us forever. Thanks for nothing, Jesus. Finally, in order to gain anything from our relationship with Yahweh, we have to die to get it. That's when we're rewarded in our death. Oh, and in order to be a part of the group of people who will eventually be saved from hell, or whatever, and the wrath of the God of the Bible, we have to be baptized into the death of Jesus because, again, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. We have to contact his blood and get it all over us. Christians are constantly praying to be covered in his blood. By the way, as an aside here, Romans 6:3-5 says that we must be buried in the likeness of Jesus' death, so we can be raised in the likeness of his resurrection. We're not really dead before we're baptized. We are only spiritually dead. And we don't really rise from death when we come out of the water. We are only spiritually alive. But that's okay. Eventually, Christians hope to rise literally from graves with a resurrection just like that of Jesus. I presume that means blind or without limbs or however they went into the grave, since Jesus came out with holes in his hands and feet and side. But wait, Paul said he hadn't yet attained to the resurrection, but was working on it. Paul had been baptized. He'd already had that resurrection that was in the likeness of the resurrection of Jesus. He was saying he hadn't attained to the big resurrection, the one Christians long for but try not to die to get it. Well, Paul was still alive. So if the resurrection was actually a rising from the literal grave, I think we all know he hadn't attained it. No sense in saying that. I'd be a little concerned if I were Christians that this spiritual resurrection is the only resurrection I could hope for. Oh, and here's another bloody detail from the good book. While they live, Christians have to eat the body of Jesus and drink his blood. I'm going to quote this to show how disgusting it is. John 6:53 through 57. Jesus therefore said to them, most assuredly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you don't have life in yourselves. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood lives in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me, he will also live because of me. Now, Christians can say it's not literal. Well, obviously not. I mean, unless you're a Catholic, of course. But it's still gross. The point is to eat that cracker and drink that grape juice and pretend in your mind that they really are the body and blood of Jesus. To think constantly about his death and be grateful that Yahweh killed him so we can benefit from his death. But it's still gross. Now, at some point, Jesus was supposed to come and end the death curse, as I said before and as the Bible claims he has done already. In fact, he was supposed to come again in the lifetime of those people he lived among and promised this second coming to. Did Jesus keep his promise any better than Yahweh kept his to the Israelites under the law of Moses? No, he did not. At least most Christians don't think he did, as they're still waiting for him. It'll be soon, though. They all know that. In every generation since Jesus arrived the first time, it's soon and very soon that he is coming back. But it's just another broken promise. Christianity is a bloody death cult. It's just blood, blood, and more blood throughout the pages of the entire Bible. Yahweh never accomplishes anything unless there is tons of blood and gore involved. It's repugnant and disturbing, and it fills the pages of the book Christians love. If this type of uncivilized and nasty concept of human sacrifice and drinking blood were in any other book, Christians would be ranting and raving about how awful it is. They'd be banning the book and saying it wasn't fit for children. Well, it's not fit for children, of course. But when it's the Christian's book that they like, it's all beautiful and lovely and pure and holy in their minds. It's all about love. That's how they viewed the book that is really all about pain and misery and death and broken promises. They eat it up, and it's disgusting. And again, wrath and vengeance are far removed from love. The truth is, Christians fight for their hellfire and brimstone, it seems to me, more than they fight for anything. You tell them there's no hell and they get very upset. One preacher ended his friendship with me because I gave him a tract on universal salvation. I didn't even say I believed it. Just told him I had some tracts someone had given me and thought he might want to see what the person was saying. He wrote me a letter, sent through the mail, not through email, saying that he liked for his friends to believe as he did, and he was ending our friendship. Now, he knew I was a preterist and he was a futurist, but that hadn't bothered him. But no hell? Yeah, he couldn't accept that. I think some Christians would say we're going to hell for no other reason than the fact that we don't believe in it. As Dan Barker said, in order to do evangelism, a Christian must first convince us we are damned before they can offer us salvation. I saw this on a video, now I can't find it, but it doesn't matter who said it, since we all know it's true. Nobody can think about salvation until they're convinced they're condemned. So that get-out-of-jail-free card is very important. A woman once said to me that if there were no hell, nobody would be good. I asked her if she would do bad things if there were no hell, and naturally she said she wouldn't, but others would. Well, I'm here to tell you that in my case, it's been much easier not to do bad things without the threat of hell hanging over me. In conclusion, Yahweh is a murderer and the father of murder. He breaks his promises to protect and save. And if I were Christians, I'd be afraid that somebody would do something. I don't know, maybe some man might wear a fancy dress that Yahweh wishes he had for himself. And Yahweh will become so irate that he'll go back on his promise to ever have Jesus return or ever reward those who bend the knee to him. just as he breached his promise to take the Israelites to the promised land. And Moses is dead, so he can't tell Yahweh that he'll look bad if he doesn't keep his promises. I'll leave you with this beautiful and loving verse from the good book. Psalm 137:9. Happy shall he be who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. It just warms my heart, yours too, I'm sure. But listen, please don't worry about any of this. We know the Bible isn't true. We know because we know the God it presents is not real. He can't be real. He's supposed to be love, right? All of this death and destruction and all the proclamations of wrath and vengeance destroy the concept that the God of the Bible is love. Love isn't wrathful. Love doesn't seek vengeance. Yahweh is wrathful and does seek vengeance. Therefore, let me hear you say it, Yahweh is not love. And the Bible is a pack of lies. Thank you all. Bye.